All right, so I'm going to lay the foundation for what we're about to talk about by starting off with a little bit of an excerpt from Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, because he does a wonderful job at defining first principles. He does it very nicely. And there's a little excerpt in it that lays the foundation of what we're about to do. And so let's start there. It states, philosophy signifies the study of wisdom, and that by wisdom is to be understood not merely prudence in the management of affairs, but a perfect knowledge of all that a man can know, as well as for the conduct of his life, as for the preservation of his health, and the discovery of all of the arts, and that knowledge to subserve these ends must necessarily be deduced from first causes. So that in order to study the acquisition of it, which is properly called philosophizing, we must commence with the investigation of those first causes, which are called principles. Now, these principles must possess two conditions. In the first place, they must be so clear and evident that the human mind, when it attentively considers them, cannot doubt of their truth. In the second place, the knowledge of other things must be so dependent on them, as that though the principles themselves may indeed be known apart from what depends on them, the latter cannot nevertheless be known apart from the former. It will accordingly be necessary thereafter to endeavor so to deduce from those principles the knowledge of the things that depend on them, as that there may be nothing in the whole series of deductions which is not perfectly manifest. So, first and foremost, I just wanted to start this out by pointing out the fact that philosophy gets a bad reputation these days. Philosophy is not some airy-fairy, theoretical, whatever nonsense. Philosophy is the study of how to be successful in all that a man can know for his health and his life. Or as I say, for his health, his wealth, his well-being, and the society's freedom. And all of this knowledge that comes from philosophizing must be deduced from these first causes, these things that I call first principles, or the general principles. These are generalities, the general principles of natural law. And then we have to know how to think or how to reason from these generalities. And if we can do that effectively, then there's nothing that you cannot know if you know these first principles and can reason from them, because the general principles of natural law constitute the governing dynamics of our reality. And also, it's important to know that first principles thinking is also called parsing by smart people. Parsing. To parse is to break a thing down into its constituent parts, explaining each part, each function, and then explaining its relationship to each other part. And this is super important because this is one of the keys to extraordinary success, because it's something that's not taught in school anymore. And when people utilize first principles thinking, they gain a massive advantage over everybody else. We need look no further than Elon Musk, because he utilizes first principles thinking in his methods to creating rocket ships. When he was first starting out with SpaceX, what he found out was that each part that he needed, well, first he found out that utilizing old rocket ships primarily from Russia, was extraordinarily expensive. It was an extraordinarily expensive thing to do. So he decided that he would make his own rockets. And so he started contacting all of these companies all across the world who made particular parts for rockets. And so he'd find some people in France who made this particular piece. And then he'd find somebody in India who made that piece. Then he'd find somebody in China and Indonesia, and somewhere maybe in like Arizona who would make the other pieces. And he found out that there's like millions of pieces to these rocket ships, and there's no one group of people who make every single piece. So he has to pay all of this extra money for shipping, for middleman costs, for the cost of the production, not just the cost of production, but also the added expense on top of the cost of production. And what he found out was that was also extremely expensive. So then he utilized first principles thinking and broke things down even further. And he found out that if he created the rocket ship from scratch, that if he had one centralized location that merely purchased the raw materials necessary to create the rocket ship, and then located them in one central place, he could create a rocket ship extraordinarily cheaper than having to purchase a part here, a part there, just like how everybody else, including NASA, US government, how they build their rockets. So now he has a ability to make rocket ships extremely cheap, on the cheap, and better and more effective, because everything is centralized, everything is in one place, everything is uniform and organized. And so that's his secret to success. And we can utilize this idea, and we're going to, when we're going to be talking about the first principles of natural law. And that's what we're going to do in the next video. And in this video, I just first want to introduce you to what I mean by natural law. What is the definition of natural law? So let's get into that. Natural law defined. Let's break it apart. We get natural and law. So starting with natural. Natural is inherent, having a basis in nature and truth, not man-made or caused by mankind. That's the key there. Natural law was discovered by studying nature. And so I just want to make a point to say that these laws were discovered. They were not invented by anybody. People who invent things, they invent ways to utilize our discoveries of natural law in everyday life. But everything, all the technology that has been invented over the past 100 years is simply a means by which we utilize these natural things that we found in nature. And next is the word law. Law is an existing condition which is binding and immutable. Immutable means cannot be changed. Cannot be changed. But the more that we know about these laws, the more that we know about these immutable, unchangeable things, the better or the easier it is for us to utilize these laws to our advantage. And that's what inventors do. Inventors don't create new laws. They utilize the laws that exist in our reality to create their inventions that allow us to tap into things that already work in our realities. So, natural law together means universal, non-man-made, binding and immutable conditions that govern the consequences of our behavior, because our behavior is natural. Another tendency that we have is to assume that humans are somehow separate from nature. And that is simply not the case. We are nature. We are of nature. We exist. We were born from nature. And so you can study a human being to find out quite a bit, pretty much everything that there is to know about our reality, because we exist as a part of our reality, of our universe. And so natural law is a body of universal laws which act as the governing dynamics of consciousness itself. Because we are conscious beings, we tap into this consciousness, and these laws are the laws that govern our consciousness. And the general principles of natural law are necessary to know. It's a need-to-know thing. I rarely say that. I say you ought to do something, or you should consider it. These are one of these things that you need to know if you want to be successful, because our existence is defined by them. And I just want to point out that by no means will just simply knowing these laws make you into a master over them. It's just an introduction. All that I'm doing here is just introducing you to these laws. And so, in a way, it's akin to reading a rule book. It's the rule book to our lives, to our reality, to our existence. But it's no different than just starting out with a game of chess. You know, you don't know the rules to chess and you look at the chessboard. Well, that's not very helpful. So you look at the rule book to see how the pieces move and how this stuff works. And then you move on from there. So that's kind of the example that we're going to use moving forward. So here's what I mean. The game of chess is played by physical pieces on a physical 64-bit board. You can physically see all of the pieces on the board, and you can see the chessboard. Everyone can see that. However, what you cannot see are the rules to the game. And yet, these rules absolutely control the physical pieces on the board in their totality. You cannot even have the pieces to chess without first having the rules that determine what that piece does, what that piece is, why it looks the way that it looks, and where it starts on the board, and how it can move, and what it does, and how it can destroy other pieces, and whether it can or can't do that. And just like the rules to chess, the rules of natural law are invisible, and yet they control our physical reality in its totality. Both the rules of chess and the rules of natural law are always at work. When you're playing the game of chess, once that game starts, those rules start immediately and they never end until the game is over. Same is the case with natural law. You're always bound by the rules, and you're always bound by these rules as long as you're playing the game, as long as you're in existence. Also, the invisible rules give the chess set all of its meaning, as a chess set without an individual's ability or an individual's knowledge of the rules is just something interesting to look at. And so just like a chess set, natural law gives our physical reality all of its meaning. And physical reality, without an individual's knowledge of natural law, of the rules that create physical reality, is just something interesting to look at. Okay? And so this one point shows us that meaning is acquired at the individual level, and this meaning remains invisible to the uninitiated. And so you could be looking at the exact same thing as somebody else who doesn't understand the meaning behind what they're looking at, and they'll see something completely different from somebody else who does know what they're looking at. And this is like when a chess player who does know the rules to chess and is pretty good at chess plays against somebody who only kind of sort of knows the rules to chess, but he can still play, but he's not quite understanding what's going on. And that's how like a good chess player can get to a point where he knows he's going to win the game like 10 moves ahead. People think that that's hubris. It's not hubris. It's a fact. And it's all based on the level of understanding that one individual has compared to another individual. And so, in other words, meaning in chess, just like the meaning in life, it varies from person to person based upon several key factors. And these key factors are the more an individual plays chess, or the more an individual experiences life, the better an individual will know the rules simply by process of elimination, by inductive reasoning, by saying like, you do something over and over and over again, and you start experiencing tendencies, start locating tendencies, and you say, okay, well, that's interesting. And this is kind of like somebody who has street smarts compared to a naive individual who hasn't gone out and lived life and had experiences, compared to somebody who was forced to live life and experience things at an early age. Also, the more an individual thinks or pays attention to the game, the more meaning the individual will find in the game. And this is for both life and for chess. Because ultimately, with more meaning comes more success. If you understand more, then you will have a higher probability of success in the topic that you understand more of. I always like to point out that it's very rare for me to say anything that's not absolutely obvious. And this one's fairly obvious. So, first and foremost, if you want to have any semblance of success in chess or in life, then it's a prerequisite that you have to, at the very least, know the rules to the game. And so that's where we're going to have to start. So with this course, I just want to point out that we borrowed heavily from the Hermetic principles found in the Kybalion, and I only utilized this book simply because it's one of the most organized lists of these principles, and that also doesn't get too overtly scientific and sciencey, where it's talking about things that don't pertain particularly to the individual or to individual success. And so the point ultimately of these principles is to just give you the fundamentals of our universe. So we know the rules, we know what's going on, we have an idea, and we can reason from these principles to come to an understanding for just about everything. And so, the general principles of natural law are as follows. The principle of mentalism, the principle of correspondence, the principle of vibration, the principle of polarity, the principle of rhythm, the principle of cause and effect, the principle of gender, and an eighth principle called the principle of care, or the principle of meaning. And so, in part 2 of this natural law series, I'm going to go over each of these principles. I'm going to break them down into their constituent parts, and I'm going to give you an introduction to each principle and what they mean. So I'll see you in the next video.